On a winter night so cold that even the mountains seemed to hold their breath, a lonely German shepherd stood trembling outside an abandoned barn at the edge of a small town called Snowbridge. Everyone believed the place was empty, forgotten by the world, but one man and one dog were about to discover a secret buried beneath the frozen floor, a secret that would test faith, courage, and the thin line between darkness and hope. Before this story unfolds, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Your presence here means more than you know. And if you believe stories of rescue miracles and second chances deserve to be shared, please press subscribe to support the channel and stay with us until the end of this unforgettable journey. Snowbridge lay buried under a storm that seemed older than memory itself, a mountain town curled between black pine forests and frozen ridgelines, where winter did not merely arrive but ruled. On this night, the blizzard did not fall, it attacked. Wind clawed at rooftops, erased footprints the moment they were made, and drove white blindness through the narrow streets like a living thing. The power grid had been unstable for weeks, lines weighed down by ice, transformers coughing in the cold. And yet, beneath the abandoned Harper farm at the edge of town, something impossible had appeared on the electrical company's infrastructure scan, an isolated heat signature, steady and human-sized, pulsing beneath a property that had been without electricity for over 3 years. The call reached the Snowbridge Police Department just before midnight, and within minutes, Officer Daniel Hayes was pulling on his jacket with hands that had learned grief long ago and never quite forgotten it. Daniel was 42, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of strength that came from years of lifting more than weights, stretchers, wreckage, injured strangers, and yet there was a permanent weariness in his posture, a slight forward tilt, as if he were always bracing against invisible wind. His hair, once black, was threaded early with gray along the temples, and his eyes carried the muted depth of a man who had loved fiercely and lost without ever truly recovering. He did not speak much at the station anymore, not since his wife died of cancer 3 winters ago. But when he did, people listened, not because he was loud, but because his calm rarely failed. By his side moved Atlas, his K9 partner, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat dark along the spine and lighter gold along the ribs, massive paws built for snow, and amber-brown eyes so alert they seemed to glow even in shadow. Atlas had been rescued from a neglect case as a malnourished pup, ribs once visible under brittle fur, but under Daniel's care, he had grown into a disciplined, intuitive working dog whose loyalty ran deeper than training alone. Where Daniel carried quiet sorrow, Atlas carried relentless purpose, as if the world's wrongness could be fixed 1 cent at a time. The convoy rolled out into the storm with deliberate coordination, one ambulance staged at the tree line, its red lights muted by snow, a fire rescue truck idling behind it, engine humming like a giant's heartbeat, 2 local deputies following in a cruiser, headlights cutting thin tunnels through the swirling white. The Harper farm appeared at last through the storm like a skeleton half swallowed by ice. The main house sagged inward, windows long shattered and boarded, and the barn stood apart like a hunched giant, its wooden ribs blackened by age and moisture, its roof bowed under decades of accumulated winters. Everyone expected a malfunction, an overheated generator forgotten by vandals, perhaps, or an eBay animal nesting near a warm pipe buried underground. Even the firefighters, seasoned men with wind-bitten faces and methodical movements, spoke lightly as they unloaded equipment, their humor a shield against cold and the unknown. Only Atlas did not share their ease. The moment his paws hit the frozen ground near the barn, his entire body altered. His ears snapped forward, muscles tightened along his shoulders, and a low vibration passed through his chest. Not a bark, not yet, but a warning hum that Daniel felt through the leash as clearly as if it had traveled up his own spine. They approached the barn together, boots crunching over wind-packed snow, the boards above them groaning and clicking as the storm pressed its invisible weight against the structure. Inside, the barn was hollow darkness, layered with drifting snow that had slipped through countless cracks. The air smelled of mold, old hay, and iron. Atlas moved slowly now, nose low, tail stiff but not raised, reading the ground in tight arcs. Then, without warning, he stopped. He planted his front paws at the exact same time, as if driven into the earth by sudden gravity, and stared at a single section of the floor. Frost glazed the wooden planks, and over them lay a hard, uneven mat of straw fused into ice. Atlas's lips pulled back slightly, revealing white teeth in a silent expression of tension rather than threat. A faint growl pulsed out of him, controlled, deliberate, not directed at any person, but at whatever lay beneath that frozen square. Daniel felt the leash tighten as Atlas leaned forward, not in panic, but in precision. "What is it, boy?" Daniel murmured, more to steady himself than to question the dog. Atlas did not look back. Then he barked, once, sharp, focused. The sound cracked through the barn and seemed to ricochet off the rafters like a warning bell. He barked again, then again, each bark tighter than the last, and began clawing at the frozen straw with violent determination, ice splintering under his paws. The firefighters fell silent. One of the deputies shifted uneasily. This was not the excited barking of a dog chasing vermin. This was an alert. Daniel raised his hand without speaking, the way he had done 1,000 times on traffic scenes, at shootings, at roadside pile-ups. "Lock the scene," he said calmly. "No one moves without my say." Into his shoulder radio, he added, "We need confined space gear and gas detection now. I think there's a void under the floor." Wind howled through the broken barn slats, as if the storm itself were listening. When the firefighters brought in their handheld oxygen and toxic gas monitors, the devices chirped uncertainly at first, then stabilized into numbers that made their expressions harden. There was air beneath them, thin, declining, but real. And where there was air, there could be life. Atlas barked again, voice roughening with strain, scraping at the frozen straw until his claws bled thin red lines against all white ice. Daniel knelt and placed a gloved hand against the dog's shoulder, not to restrain him, but to ground the moment, and in that instant, the storm outside felt very far away. For a breath, doubt flickered among the team. Cutting through the floor in these conditions was dangerous. Collapse was possible. Gas pockets could be lethal, but Atlas did not waver. He barked as if counting down against a clock no one else could see. Daniel stood, straightened to his full height, snow crusting along the hem of his jacket, and his voice, when it came, carried not urgency but certainty. "We open the floor," he said, "but we do it by protocol." The firefighters exchanged a glance and nodded. Even the storm seemed, for just a second, to hesitate. The saw screamed as it bit into frozen wood, a metallic cry swallowed and reshaped by the blizzard outside. Firefighters worked in measured rhythm, not rushing, not hesitating, their gloved hands steady despite the storm battering the barn like a furious tide. The floor resisted at first, wood stiffened by years of rot and winter's grip, but steel always wins eventually. A rectangular section gave way with a dull crack, and beneath it, hidden like a secret meant never to be spoken aloud, lay a steel hatch mottled with rust and ice. At its center was a narrow ventilation hole, no wider than a man's thumb, faint warmth ghosting out into the freezing air like the breath of something trapped between worlds. Daniel Hayes stood just behind the firefighters, shoulders squared, eyes never leaving the opening. Snow clung to his eyebrows and the creases beside his eyes. Atlas pressed against his leg, muscles coiled, every instinct in the dog vibrating with alertness. Atlas was 4 years old now, at the peak of his working life, his coat thick and weather-hardened, his chest broad with strength built for endurance rather than speed. He was not barking anymore. He was waiting. The firefighters pried the hatch open inch by inch. Before anyone descended, procedure unfolded like an ancient ritual of survival. A harness was clipped and tested twice. Oxygen levels were checked again, the device chirping anxiously but not yet in full alarm. Headlamps flicked on, narrow beams cutting into the darkness below. The ambulance crew moved closer, their posture shifting from standby to readiness, the way soldiers change stance when the battle becomes real. Then the hatch opened wide enough for a man to slip through. Cold rushed upward from the void like a living current, carrying with it the smell of damp earth, metal, and something faintly chemical. The first firefighter descended slowly, boots scraping against the ladder rungs, his breathing audible over the radio. His voice emerged a few seconds later, altered by distance and tension. "There are people down here," he said quietly. Children. The word struck the air like a blow. More rescuers followed, lights multiplying in the darkness below until the hidden space was revealed in fragments. Walls of raw earth reinforced with uneven planks. A makeshift ventilation pipe running upward toward the barn floor, its edges sealed with crude foam. At one end of the underground chamber, a cheap electric space heater flickered weakly, its coil glowing orange in fragile pulses, as if afraid to draw too much power from a world that had already forgotten this place. And between the heater and the far wall lay 4 small shapes wrapped in thin blankets that barely hid how still they were. 4 children. They had been bound at the wrists with white plastic zip ties, skin reddened and swollen, where circulation struggled to return. Their breaths came shallow and uneven, tiny clouds lifting weakly into the cold air. Each child had an IV line taped to a bare arm, tubing dangling empty now, the bags above them already drained. On a warped wooden table nearby lay several used syringes and small empty vials, arranged with unnerving order. Next to them was a notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting that recorded times and dosages, with the obsessive care of someone who believed precision made cruelty acceptable. The first firefighter reached the nearest child and checked for a pulse. "They're alive," he said into the radio, his voice tightening. "Barely, but alive." The ambulance crew moved instantly. Stretcher frames were lowered through the hatch. Warm blankets followed. The operation became a blur of coordinated motion, hands lifting small bodies with the gentleness reserved for broken glass, oxygen masks fitting over pale faces, fingers counting pulse beats aloud. The children were thin, their faces hollowed by fear and sedation, lips tinged faintly blue from cold and low oxygen. The oldest stirred first, his eyelids fluttering like the wings of a wounded bird. He was perhaps 12, maybe 13, with dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, his skin a sickly gray under the stark light of the headlamps. His eyes struggled to focus, moving slowly over the shapes around him until they landed on Daniel, who had knelt at the hatch's edge, his face framed by swirling snow. "It's okay," Daniel said softly, his voice pitched low and steady. "You're safe now. We've got you." The boy's lips trembled as he forced the words out through a throat raw with cold and thirst. "My name is Mason. Mason Lee," he whispered. Each breath sounded like it cost him something precious. I think we're running out of time." The sentence was not dramatic. It was factual. That was what made it unbearable. One by one, the children were brought up into the storm. The wind tore at the blankets, but rescuers shielded them with their own bodies as they transferred them into the ambulance's waiting warmth. Atlas watched in absolute stillness, head high, ears forward, eyes tracking each small form as it rose from the darkness he had found. When the last child was lifted free, his tail moved once, slow, controlled, then stilled again. The ambulance doors slammed shut, sealing heat and fragile life inside. Sirens did not wail. The storm was too fierce for sound to matter. Instead, the vehicle pulled away with its lights dimmed against the snow, carrying the children toward Snowbridge Regional Hospital and the thin promise of survival. The hospital rose from the storm like a fortress of light, its windows blazing gold against the blue-black night. Inside, heat wrapped around everyone at once, fogging glasses, thawing stiff fingers, pulling shivers from bones that had braced too long against winter. Nurses moved with brisk purpose, voices low but urgent. The children were rushed into trauma bays, their clothes cut away. IV, lines reestablished, monitors attached. Daniel stood just outside the treatment area, helmet tucked under his arm, snow melting into dark patches on his uniform. Atlas sat beside him, posture flawless despite exhaustion, eyes never leaving the door through which the stretchers had vanished. A man emerged from one of the side corridors then, drawn by the call that had rippled through the hospital like an electric shock. 4 pediatric abductions inbound. Dr. Raymond Hart was 58 years old, tall and carefully groomed, with silver hair combed back from a high, thoughtful forehead, and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the permanent air of a scholar. His white lab coat hung neatly from broad but aging shoulders, the fabric spotless despite the chaos around him. Years of pediatric practice had etched fine lines of concern around his eyes and mouth, lines that softened his expression into something almost permanently kind. He had built his reputation on patience, on long nights spent beside sick children, on a voice that never rose even when parents broke. People trusted him the way one trusts a lighthouse, quietly, without needing to understand how the light worked. "Where are they?" Hart asked as he approached Daniel, his voice calm but threaded with unmistakable urgency. Daniel looked at him, recognition flickering. He had seen this man before. Everyone in Snowbridge had. And more than that, this was the doctor who had once treated his own wife during her final months, the man who had stood at the foot of their hospital bed and spoken gently of hope even when hope had already begun to fail. "Trauma Bay 2 and 3, Daniel replied. "They were found in an underground space, severe hypothermia, sedation. We don't know what they were given yet." Hart's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll take the lead on at least one of them," he said. "I know the staff, and I have experience with complex pediatric tox cases." It was a reasonable request, a reassuring one, the kind of thing a man like him would say. And yet, at that exact moment, Atlas shifted, not forward in aggression, not backward in fear. He moved sideways instead, placing his body subtly between Daniel and Hart. His posture remained disciplined, no raised hackles, no bared teeth. But his ears angled sharply toward the doctor, and a low, almost inaudible sound vibrated in his chest, more tension than growl. Daniel felt it through the leash as surely as he had felt the first warning in the barn. He looked down at Atlas, puzzled. "Easy," he murmured. Hart glanced at the dog with a mild, puzzled smile. "He's very attentive," he observed lightly. "Good working animal." There was no irritation in his tone, only professional interest. Atlas did not move. His eyes stayed fixed on Hart with a quiet intensity that was profoundly unsettling, precisely because it was so controlled. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped around, the dog to clear the path. Hart nodded once and moved on toward the trauma bays, his white coat disappearing into the bright corridor where the children fought for breath. Atlas remained where he was, muscles taut, watching until the door swung closed behind the doctor. Only then did his posture ease slightly, as if a held breath had been released. Daniel did not yet understand why a faint chill crawled through him that had nothing to do with winter. Snowbridge slept uneasily after the rescue, as if the town itself had sensed that the night had only pretended to end. The storm loosened its grip by morning, but it did not retreat. Snow still fell in slow, heavy spirals, layering silence over rooftops and streets already swollen with white. Inside Snowbridge Regional Hospital, however, there was no silence at all. Machines whispered and beeped in steady rhythm. Nurses passed in quick, efficient blurs. And behind glass walls, 4 children lay suspended between the memory of cold and the fragile return of warmth. Daniel Hayes had not gone home. He sat on a bench outside the pediatric intensive care unit, helmet resting at his feet, his jacket unzipped, as if he had forgotten the concept of cold entirely. Atlas lay beside him, paws tucked neatly beneath his chest, eyes half-lidded, but never fully closed. The dog had not slept since the barn. Neither had Daniel. The first blood test results came just after dawn. A young lab technician, pale and wide-eyed from the weight of what he was carrying, approached Daniel with a tablet held like something fragile enough to shatter if dropped. "Officer Hayes," he said quietly, "we ran full tox screens on all 4 children. There's something you need to see." The results glowed cold and clinical on the screen. All 4 children carried traces of the same primary sedative in their bloodstream, a rare pediatric anesthetic, one not used casually, one reserved for controlled surgical settings under strict monitoring. It was not something a kidnapper could buy at a local pharmacy, not something that drifted through illegal street markets in neat, sterile vials. It was hospital-grade, inventory-tracked, and tightly guarded. Daniel felt the weight of it settle into his chest like ice. "So, whoever did this had access?" he said. "Yes," the technician replied. "Direct access, and experience using it." That information moved through the hospital like a dark pulse. The pharmacy department was contacted within the hour. Logs were pulled, timestamps examined, security footage reviewed. Dr. Raymond Hart himself stood at the pharmacy counter during the review, sleeves rolled slightly as he spoke in measured tones to the staff pharmacist, his posture composed, his expression one of professional concern. "These children were sedated with precision," Hart said calmly. "The dosages reflect knowledge, not guesswork. Whoever administered it understood pediatric tolerance." The pharmacist nodded, fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. "That's what worries me," she said. "These medications don't leave the vault without a digital trail." The trail appeared almost immediately. A small quantity of the anesthetic had been logged as withdrawn 2 nights before, documented as used for routine procedures, common surgeries that usually dotted any pediatric ward schedule. But when administrators cross-referenced surgical records and operating room footage for the matching time window, there were no corresponding cases, no patients, no surgeries. The medication had been signed out into a silence that did not belong to any procedure. Daniel stood at the edge of the pharmacy office as the discrepancy emerged, watching the way tension shifted across the faces of professionals trained to keep fear tightly leashed. At first, the anomaly seemed technical, an error in recording perhaps, a software glitch. Snowbridge was a small town. Mistakes happened. But then Maria Collins arrived. Maria was 60 years old, short and solidly built, with weathered hands and a spine that refused to bend under the weight of decades spent in child welfare. Her hair had once been chestnut and was now silver, pulled back in a practical twist that left her face open and honest. She moved with the quiet authority of someone who had stood in too many courtrooms and too many living rooms where hope trembled on the edge of extinction. She had come as soon as she heard the names of the children, her breath caught in her throat the moment she saw Mason through the ICU glass. "3 of them," she said later to Daniel in a low voice, standing beside the vending machines in the hallway. "3 of the 4, I know them." Daniel turned to her sharply. "From where?" "From referrals," she replied. "Charity cases, foster placement evaluations, emergency assistance files, all connected in different ways through the same foundation." She hesitated, as if the next words resisted her mouth. "A foundation where Dr. Hart serves as a senior advisor." The hallway seemed to narrow around them. Daniel's instinctive response was not accusation, but defense. Hart had treated his wife. Hart had held his daughter's hand when Emily was small and terrified in an emergency room years ago. Hart was woven into the town's sense of safety like mortar between bricks. "That doesn't mean anything by itself," Daniel said. Maria studied him with the weary gentleness of someone who had watched good people try to make bad information softer by refusing its edges. "It means something," she said quietly. "It doesn't prove guilt, but it means the pattern isn't random." Over the next several hours, Daniel observed without comment as Dr. Hart moved between the ICU rooms with practiced precision, checking vitals, adjusting drips, speaking softly to nurses and parents alike. His presence reassured everyone. His voice remained steady, his hands sure. And yet, each time Hart approached the children, Atlas stirred. The dog never barked. He never bared teeth. He simply rose from where he lay, stepped forward, and placed himself subtly between Daniel and the doctor, like a living barrier formed not of aggression, but of quiet insistence. Daniel noticed it every time, and every time he told himself the same thing. Dogs had instincts, yes, but instincts were not warrants. Instincts were not evidence. Atlas might be reacting to unfamiliar scents, to medical chemicals, to nothing more than the echo of the barn. He refused stubbornly to let his mind lean too hard in any direction. The second call from the lab came that afternoon. It did not arrive with panic. It arrived with the flat, surgical precision of data that does not care what it destroys. The technician met Daniel in the administrative wing, his hands no longer trembling. "We isolated a secondary compound in the children's blood," he said. "It's not normally stored in the general pharmaceutical vault. It's kept in a secured refrigerator cabinet with restricted access." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Who has clearance?" The technician hesitated. "A small list, primarily senior physicians with toxicology privileges." He tapped the tablet once. "We pulled the access log. The most recent entry belongs to Dr. Raymond Hart, time-stamped within 30 minutes of the estimated injection window." For a moment, Daniel heard only the low hum of the hospital ventilation system. The world narrowed to the rhythm of his own heartbeat, and the soft sound of Atlas's breathing at his side. He closed his eyes briefly, not in denial, but in instinctive restraint, as if by closing them he might prevent something from breaking. "There could be an explanation," he said at last, though the words felt thin even as he spoke them. "There always is," the technician replied, "but the data is what it is." The final fracture came from an entirely different direction. Late that evening, while administrators and investigators were still parsing records, a patrol officer quietly brought Daniel a preliminary forensic report related to the girl Dr. Hart had earlier described to the town as his kidnapped granddaughter, the same child whose supposed abduction had drawn immediate sympathy and intensified the hospital's emotional atmosphere. The report was brief, clinical, devastating. Blood typing showed no rare familial markers matching Hart's documented lineage. There was no genetic alignment that could place her within his immediate family. The grandfather's grief, until now accepted as self-evident truth, no longer aligned with biology. The mask cracked. Daniel stood alone in a narrow administrative hallway when the implications finally settled fully into his bones. He leaned back against the cool wall and exhaled slowly, the sound rough in his own ears. Across the hall, through a narrow window, he saw Dr. Hart standing beside one of the ICU beds, head slightly bowed, hands folded as if in prayer. For a brief, treacherous second, the old image tried to reassert itself. The dedicated physician, the pillar of the community, the man who had once spoken softly to a dying woman about comfort and light. Then Atlas moved again. The dog rose without command, stepped forward until his body aligned with Daniel's leg, and stared directly at Hart through the glass. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply watched. And for the first time since the barn, Daniel did not correct him. The warrant was signed at 3:17 a.m., the ink still fresh when the first patrol car rolled into the driveway of Dr. Raymond Hart's home on the eastern slope of Snowbridge. Snow fell gently now, deceptively calm after the violence of the earlier storm, blanketing the streets in a pale, forgiving quiet that felt undeserved. Daniel Hayes stood beside the lead agent as the team approached the front door, Atlas alert at his heel, breath steaming in the cold. The house was dark, no lights, no sound. When the door was breached and the officers swept through room by room with practiced precision, they found only absence. The bed was cold, closets half empty. The garage stood open and bare. Dr. Hart had vanished. In the stillness of his abandoned office downtown, among the orderly shelves of medical texts and framed certificates, investigators found not chaos but control. His desk was clean, too clean, wiped of fingerprints with deliberate care. Only a few loose pages remained in the center drawer, notes written in the same careful hand that had recorded IV dosages beneath the barn. The heading on each page chilled even the hardened agents who read it. Behavioral and sensory response of K9 units in extreme environmental stress. The disappearance transformed suspicion into certainty. Within hours, federal jurisdiction was invoked. The FBI arrived in Snowbridge with dark SUVs and quiet authority, folding the local operation into something broader, colder, and far-reaching. Credit card logs were pulled, fuel station records examined, property registries connected to foundations Hart had once advised were scoured for irregular holdings. Bit by bit, a fractured map began to assemble itself. The most fragile piece came from Mason Lee. The boy was still weak, still wrapped in wires and soft beeping machines. But when Daniel stood beside his bed and asked gently if he remembered anything about where he had been held before the barn, Mason's eyes closed as if searching backward through fog. "I remember wind," he whispered hoarsely. Not like outside wind, like it was moving through something long. And the walls, they smelled like wet dirt and old metal, like rust. I think it was underground, somewhere bigger than the barn. That description, combined with the credit card trail, pointed the operation north, toward Black Ridge Mountain. 2 decades earlier, a mining collapse had sealed the last operational shafts, and the mountain had been declared geologically unstable, its tunnels buried beneath millions of tons of rock and silence. Since then, It had become the kind of place locals avoided by instinct rather than signage, a dark hump of forested menace rising against the winter sky. Satellite imagery revealed recent vehicle movement along one of the long abandoned service roads. It was enough. As night fell again, the rescue became a mission. This time, there would be no lone pursuit, no solitary gamble born of desperation. This time the mountain would be met by a system. Armored vehicles climbed the winding pass. Search and rescue teams moved with thermal gear and breathing apparatus. Medical units followed close behind. FBI tactical teams spread in coordinated arcs through the forest, their silhouettes ghosted in snow and shadow. And through it all, Atlas ran point, not ahead in reckless speed, but in deliberate, relentless intent. The German shepherd's nose dipped and lifted in rhythmic calculation, parsing the mountain's ancient languages of sap, soil, decay, and frozen stone. To humans, Black Ridge smelled of cold and pine. To Atlas, it told a far richer story, of recent tire rubber compressed into ice, of gasoline traces carried on wind-scraped bark, of the faint human signature woven through moss and metal like a thread of wrongness in the tapestry of nature. Daniel followed behind him, rifle slung but unused, eyes on the dog's movements as if they were a living map. The forest thickened as they climbed, pines standing like silent witnesses burdened with white. Somewhere above them, the mountain breathed slowly, its buried tunnels whispering with trapped air and water. Atlas's pace quickened near a rock face half concealed by fallen trees. There, beneath a ledge of broken stone, a dark opening yawned just wide enough for a man to slip inside. Warm air exhaled faintly from its depths. The mine was not dead after all. Teams moved into position. Cameras were threaded through narrow gaps. Heat signatures bloomed on the monitors. 3 small, closely clustered forms inside, alive. And deeper still, a solitary adult heat source near a control panel mounted into the rough concrete wall of a reinforced chamber. They descended with silence drilled into muscle. The interior of the mine was a wound in the earth, raw rock walls slick with condensation, rusted rails half buried beneath debris, cables snaking along the ceiling like black veins. Far within, the tunnel widened into a sealed compartment that did not belong to any original mining blueprint. Someone had built this space intentionally. The chamber was crude but functional. 3 thin mattresses lay on the floor. Portable heaters glowed weakly in the corners. A ventilation system ran through improvised ducts punched into the outer rock. And mounted on a folding table near the far wall stood a network of cameras, monitors, and handwritten charts tracking pulse, core temperature, and oxygen saturation. It was not merely a holding cell. It was a laboratory. The children lay still but breathing, their chests rising faintly beneath their blankets. Between them and the exit, silhouetted by the glow of control screens, stood Dr. Raymond Hart. He looked smaller here, stripped of white coat and hospital authority, dressed instead in heavy winter gear, but his posture remained composed. In his right hand, he held a compact control device connected by cable to the ventilation system. When he spoke, his voice carried, without strain through the cavern. "If you take another step forward," he said calmly, "the airflow stops. You have less than a minute before hypoxia sets in." Weapons were raised but not fired. Negotiators' voices slid into the chamber through speakers, steady and controlled, offering time, offering alternatives, offering life as a currency that had already been spent too freely. Hart listened with detached interest. "You don't understand what I was trying to prove," he replied. "Dogs, children, survival thresholds, extreme conditions reveal pure response. I was only observing." While words moved back and forth like chess pieces, Atlas moved without sound. Daniel had given a hand signal so slight it barely disturbed the air. The dog slipped into shadow, using the uneven pillars of the old mine as cover, body-hugging darkness with instinctual intelligence. His path arced wide, avoiding direct lines of sight, the way wolves circle prey not to attack, but to end the fight before it begins. Hart's attention remained fixed on the negotiator's voice, on the illusion of control offered by the device in his hand. He never saw the shadow detach itself from the wall. Daniel's voice, when it came, was no louder than a breath. "Atlas! Now!" The German Shepherd exploded forward with silent force, a blur of muscle and purpose. He did not go for the throat. He did not bare teeth in rage. He went for the hand. Jaws locked around Hart's forearm with crushing precision, twisting just enough to wrench the control device free without tearing flesh. Hart cried out, not in pain, but in shock, as the illusion of power vanished from his grasp. FBI operators surged in an instant later, weapons trained, bodies slamming Hart to the stone floor, cuffs snapping shut around wrists that had once guided a scalpel with benevolent care. The ventilation system continued to hum. Air did not stop. The children did not suffocate. Rescue teams poured into the chamber, oxygen masks already in motion, blankets lifted, voices rising with relief as vital signs stabilized under fresh air and warmth. Atlas released his hold and stepped back instantly at Daniel's sharp command, returning to heel with disciplined calm, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But Daniel saw the faint tremor in the dog's flank, the tremble of adrenaline finally draining. 3 more lives were lifted from darkness that night, not by a single hero, not by a single act of courage, but by a chain of hands and systems that refused to break. And at the center of it all stood a German shepherd whose nose had heard what the world had tried to bury. The storm finally loosened its grip on Snowbridge 3 days after the Black Ridge rescue, not with celebration, but with a wary pause, as if winter itself were holding its breath to see what the town would do next. Snow still lay in deep drifts along every curb and rooftop, but the wind had stilled, and the sky above the mountains stretched pale and indifferent. In that quiet, the scale of what had been uncovered began to unfold. Dr. Raymond Hart's primary residence and his remote cabin properties were sealed and searched under federal authority. What they found did not resemble the disorder of a man in panic. It resembled the careful archive of obsession. Hidden behind false walls and beneath floor panels were encrypted drives, neatly labeled notebooks, charts, and diagrams that stripped away any remaining illusion of accident. Pages were filled with phrases that made seasoned investigators fall silent. Optimal depth, controlled hypothermic exposure, oxygen deprivation thresholds, juvenile survival response, and again, canine behavioral adaptation in extreme cold. Hart had not seen himself as a mere predator. He had seen himself as a researcher, standing outside morality, harvesting suffering as if it were neutral data. Among the recovered files, one entry stood apart, highlighted as if for future reference: Site C, Lakeside Root Cellar. Next to it were GPS coordinates tracing the rim of Frost Lake, a vast frozen body of water nestled between the western ridges and the old timberline. The name struck Daniel Hayes with unexpected force. Frost Lake was not just a dot on a map to him. It was memory. Years ago, before illness hollowed out their home and grief dismantled what remained, he had camped there with his wife and young daughter, Emily. He remembered laughter skimming across open water, remembered how Emily used to skip stones until her arms trembled with effort. That place had been a reservoir of warmth once. Now the coordinates hummed with the threat of something buried. Emily arrived in Snowbridge before dawn the next morning, her car dusted with road salt and fatigue. She was 26 now, tall and slender, with her mother's dark eyes and Daniel's stubborn chin, her hair pulled into a practical knot at the nape of her neck. Years in the city had sharpened her confidence but not dulled her empathy. She worked as a trauma counselor, drawn to broken places not as a thrill but as a calling she had never been able to silence. When she stepped into the command vehicle near Frost Lake, Daniel felt the collision of 2 lives he had struggled to keep separate: the father who had once failed to save his wife, and the officer now standing at the edge of another abyss. "I know this area," Emily said quietly, studying the map spread across the dashboard. Her voice carried steadiness, but he could see the tension in her fingers as they rested on the paper. "There are old cabins here. Most of them were built in the 50s and 60s. Back then, people stored food underground through winter. Root cellars, storm shelters, sometimes both." She traced 2 small rectangles near the southern curve of the lake. "These 2 are still structurally intact, or at least they were the last time I was here." Frost Lake lay under a sheet of ice that looked solid from a distance, but whispered its fragility with every low groan and shifting crack. The ring of abandoned cabins stood like sentinels around the frozen water, their windows blind, doors sealed with drifted snow. FBI teams moved in tight formation, boots crunching softly, breath rising in faint clouds. K9 Atlas stepped forward at Daniel's side, his posture alert but controlled, nostrils flaring as he tasted the cold air. Every abandoned place carried history in its scent. Old smoke, rotted wood, the fading echo of human warmth. But Atlas searched for something newer, something wrong. At the first cabin, the door yielded under pressure with a hollow creak. Inside was only decay. Snow had blown through shattered windows and gathered in pale dunes across warped floorboards. The air smelled of mold and mouse droppings. Atlas circled once, nose moving methodically, then returned to Daniel without a sound. No alert, no signal. The second cabin stood slightly apart, its porch half buried beneath a drift that reached the railing. The front steps told their own quiet story. The snow there was not smooth and untouched, but compressed in narrow tracks, faint lines where weight had come and gone more than once. A vehicle had approached close enough for someone to dismount. The air near the door carried a sharper scent. Disinfectant, metal, a breath of something clinical that did not belong to wilderness. Atlas froze, his ears angled forward, his head lowered, and his breathing shifted into quick, controlled pulls. This time, his signal was unmistakable. He barked once, low and resonant, the sound rolling through the cabin shell like distant thunder. Inside, the living space was stripped almost bare. A torn rug lay crooked at the center of the floor, its fabric stiff with frost. Atlas moved toward it with purposeful steps, then stopped and placed one paw at its edge. His nails clicked softly against steel beneath. FBI technicians moved in with caution. There was no cinematic rush for passwords, no desperate code entered by trembling hands. Instead, they unfolded a quiet ballet of precision. A portable power unit hummed softly. Lock bypass tools were aligned with clinical care. Within minutes, the steel hatch beneath the rug gave a dull mechanical sigh and released. Cold air poured upward from the darkness below, carrying with it the muted scent of human breath. Light flooded down into the hidden space, and with it, hope fell like something tangible. Two children lay below, wrapped tightly together beneath heavy blankets. They were small, both likely under 10, their faces starkly pale against the darkness. Curls of blonde hair pressed damp against their foreheads. Their chests rose in shallow, synchronized rhythm, breaths faint but real. They had been bound at the wrists as the others had been, but their bindings had loosened slightly with struggling and time. Their eyes fluttered open almost simultaneously as the light struck them, wide with fear that trembled on the edge of disbelief. "It's okay," Daniel said softly from above, his voice steady even as his pulse thundered. "You're not alone anymore. We're here." The children stared upward as if looking at the sky through the bottom of a well. One of them, a boy with a narrow face and startlingly clear eyes, opened his mouth but did not speak at first, his lips trembling as if language itself were something fragile he had nearly lost. When he did finally whisper, his voice was thin but unbroken. I heard barking," he said. "In my dreams, a dog barking. I thought maybe God sent him." Atlas leaned forward, lowering his head just past the edge of the hatch. His amber eyes met the boy's gaze, warm and steady, breath drifting softly into the underground cold. His tail moved once, a gentle arc through the air. It was not a gesture of triumph. It was reassurance. Rescue unfolded with practiced tenderness. Harnesses were secured, blankets wrapped tighter, small bodies lifted upward into waiting arms that did not let go. Emily stood just beyond the circle of light, hands pressed to her mouth, tears freezing at the corners of her eyes as she watched the children emerge one by one. Daniel did not notice the tears until later. In that moment, he only watched the children's chests rise as they were carried past him, alive. The last stretcher cleared the hatch. The steel door was left open behind them, the underground space exposed and emptied at last, its silence no longer holding secrets. Frost Lake lay quiet beyond the cabin walls, its frozen surface reflecting the pale morning like a vast, unblinking eye. The rescue team moved with purposeful speed toward the ambulances waiting beyond the trees. In the distance, the town of Snowbridge waited, unaware that the final pieces had just been lifted from the dark. A year passed in Snowbridge the way winter always loosened its grip there, slowly, stubbornly, in reluctant surrender to change. Snow still fell, still hushed the streets and bent the pines beneath its weight, but it no longer carried the same dread it once had. The storms came and went as storms always would, yet the town had learned that not every darkness was meant to last forever. Far from Snowbridge, in a federal detention center sealed in glass and steel, Dr. Raymond Hart waited for judgment. The man who had once walked hospital corridors in a spotless white coat now wore gray like everyone else, stripped of titles and illusions alike. The case against him unfolded not as a single crime, but as a web: kidnapping across county lines, abuse of medical authority, illegal experimentation, conspiracy, obstruction. Files reached into other states. Names fell one by one: doctors, lawyers, facilitators who had once hidden behind paperwork and donations. The idea that evil required only monsters had died with the investigation. What remained was the harder truth. Sometimes it wore kindness like a disguise. Back in Snowbridge, the town chose not to let that truth petrify them. In the spring that followed the rescues, long after the ice had retreated from Frost Lake and the first wildflowers clawed their way through thawed soil, demolition crews moved onto a lot at the edge of town. The structure there had been a warehouse once, abandoned, waterlogged, home only to dust and echoes. By autumn, it became something else entirely. They called it Snowbridge Hope Center. It was not grand. It did not need to be. Wide windows let in light even on overcast days. Rooms were built for learning, for play, for counseling, for silence when silence was necessary. On the day the doors opened, the entire town seemed to arrive at once, bundled in coats, faces red from wind and emotion. Children whose eyes once carried only fear now ran through hallways shouting with the reckless trust of those who had begun to believe again. In the courtyard stood a statue cast in bronze, a German shepherd captured not in violence but in vigilance, ears forward, spine straight, weight balanced as if ready to move at the first whisper of need. At its base was a single line, engraved without flourish: Atlas, he found them when no one else could. Daniel Hayes stood before the statue longer than anyone else on opening day. Time had drawn more silver through his hair, but something else had changed as well, something deeper than age. The man who once carried his grief like an invisible anchor now moved with a steadier ease, as if the weight had not vanished, but had finally found a place to rest. He lived in the same modest house on the quiet edge of town, the one that still smelled faintly of old pine and coffee in the mornings. Atlas slept now beneath the same armchair every evening, curled into the shape of quiet guardianship, his muzzle dusted with the first soft gray that came. With maturity, Emily had not gone back to the city. She stayed. At first it had been temporary, then for a while, and then, without ceremony, simply home. She became one of the lead counselors at Snowbridge Hope Center, her days filled with listening rather than rescuing, with rebuilding rather than chasing. She learned each child's silences as carefully as she once learned their words, and in a way, she learned her father again too. Mason came often. He no longer walked with the tentative steps of a boy, unsure whether the world would collapse beneath him. He ran now. He laughed. Sometimes he helped Atlas brush snow from his coat in winter. Sometimes he sat at Daniel's kitchen table doing homework while Emily brewed tea and pretended not to watch the way relief stitched their lives together in ordinary moments. Snow fell again on the first anniversary of the barn rescue, not violently but gently, drifting through the late afternoon like something almost tender. Daniel sat on the front porch beneath the overhang, mug warming his palms, watching the slow descent of white across the yard. Atlas lay at his feet, chest rising and falling in the rhythm of a creature at peace. Emily joined him with a blanket and settled close, her shoulder brushing his arm. For a long while they spoke nothing at all. The memory arrived without invitation, as memories often did. The first day he had seen Atlas at the rescue shelter, a skeletal German shepherd behind cold steel bars, eyes too large for his face, ribs mapped beneath brittle fur. A dog discarded not with cruelty, but with indifference, which was somehow worse. Daniel remembered how the dog had not barked, had not whimpered. He had only watched quietly, as if measuring the worth of the world through the eyes of a stranger. "You pulled me out of the dark," Daniel murmured now, barely audible over the soft hush of falling snow. Atlas's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but he did not lift his head. He did not need to. Emily's voice broke the quiet, gentle but steady. "I used to think you chose your work over me," she said. Daniel turned toward her slowly. The words landed not as accusation, but as confession. She continued, eyes fixed on the snow, as if it carried answers. "Every time the phone rang, you left. Every time something went wrong in the world, you ran toward it, and I thought that meant I didn't matter enough to make you stay." The wind moved softly through the bare branches. Daniel felt the ache of old guilt rise, familiar and sharp. But before he could speak, Emily went on. "But when I saw you carry those children out of the hatches, when I saw how your hands shook and you kept walking anyway, I understood something different." She looked at him then, really looked. "You didn't know how to save yourself after Mom died, so you kept saving everyone else instead." Daniel closed his eyes once, just for a second. When he opened them, his lashes were wet. "Atlas saved me," he said simply, "the same way he saved them." Atlas exhaled deeply, a long, contented breath that steamed faintly in the cold air, and shifted closer until his flank pressed lightly against Daniel's leg. The town lights glowed beyond the trees in soft amber bands. Down the street, the Hope Center windows shone warm and steady against the falling snow. Children's laughter drifted faintly through the evening, high, bright, unmistakably alive. Snowbridge would never forget what had been buried beneath its barns, lakes, and mountains. The scars would remain, quiet and real. But the town had learned something else as well. That darkness did not own the last word. Not here, not tonight. Not while a once-abandoned dog slept with one eye always half open, and a man who had lost everything finally learned how to keep what remained. The snow continued to fall, and the light chose to stay. In the quiet end of this journey, we are reminded that the miracles of God do not always arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come through the loyalty of a humble dog, through the courage of a broken man who chooses to stand again, and through the small breaths of children who refuse to give up. In our daily lives, we all face moments of fear, loneliness, and doubt. But God walks beside us even when we feel lost, guiding our steps through people, places, and moments we never expect. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from, and type Amen. If you believe in the gentle miracles God still sends into our lives, may the Lord bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And please remember to support the channel by pressing subscribe so we can continue bringing you stories of faith, healing, and quiet miracles.